Good evening, spooky people. Welcome to another Campfire Ghost Stories. Tonight is our last reading before Turkey Day, so I thought it fitting to choose a story that occurs around the holidays. Tonight's reading is The Tree of Self-Knowledge by Stephen Graham Jones. And if you would like to read it for yourself, you can check it out in Ellen Datlow's anthology, Echoes. I'll provide a link to it in the description. Also, if you aren't familiar with Stephen Graham Jones's writing, I would seriously recommend checking out some of his short and long fiction in our catalog. I recommended his book, The Night of the Mannequins, in my 5 and 5 a few weeks ago, and I can say that his contributions to the horror genre have been unique and refreshing. This story focuses on sacrifices and scapegoats to misfortune of a supernatural nature. It contemplates the question if other people's misfortune can take the place of our own, and if their suffering can help shield us from all suffering. It is an interesting question given our current worldwide situation and the emotional and intellectual bargaining many of us are going through this holiday season with our loved ones and friends. But rather than give anything more away, let's begin. This is The Tree of Self-Knowledge by Stephen Graham Jones. Jeannie Silber died the night of our prom, 19 years ago. I almost just said it was an ugly wreck, but any wreck that snatches 2 kids in their senior year is ugly, I think. For years afterward, Clint Burcott's Grand Prix was the one you'd see in the parades, being pulled on a flatbed trailer. They never even put signs or words on it, or on the doors of the truck pulling it. But it didn't need any signs. Its crunched-in front end and shattered windshield and crumpled doors and wheels not in line with each other anymore was warning enough. Because of Jeannie and Clint, class after class of Titans graduated whole and intact. Not dead, not ramming into a dull yellow grass-cutting tractor cocked in the ditch. There was never any explanation for how Clint's car got caught far off the road. It was a tragedy, plain and simple. Clint and Jeannie were just like the rest of us. They were going to class, counting the days, biting their fingernails about jobs and life and kids and everything else that was coming for us. Clint wasn't the quarterback. Jeannie wasn't homecoming queen. Normal kids. Part-time jobs, church, probably 2 times a month out of habit. He was a tow-headed, and she had kind of red hair like her mom. This was, I believe, their 4th official date. Maybe they were going to keep on with each other, too. Maybe they were going to have the next crop of kids to catch candy at a parade and then stare at the wrecked car being dragged past. I didn't go to prom myself, not because of any intuition or premonition. This isn't that kind of place. I'm not that kind of person. But for the usual reason. I didn't have a date. My girlfriend Chrissy had dumped me 2 weeks before, and cried so hard while doing it, I thought she was going to choke. All these years later, I can't even remember exactly why she broke up. But I do remember the relief I felt when it was over. It wasn't the pleasure of being unattached at the hip, released into the wild again. It was that, with graduation looming, one of us was going to have to break up. It was either that or get married. You grow up in a small town like Milford. This is just how it works. I did end up married, of course. And that next year even, to Kay, the love of my life. She's from Haverly, the next town over, and graduated a year before I did. We met at the courthouse of all places, where we were both paying speeding tickets. I know that probably sounds like I'm setting something up. Jeannie died in a car going, by the highway patrol's estimation, 70+ miles per hour. And a year later, I got popped doing 35 in a school zone. But it's not any setup. The cops around here have a quota. tickets are a main source of revenue for the county. As for me and Jeannie, there's nothing really to tell. We'd gone to a movie in the park together in either 7th or 8th grade, but had gone different ways by the time the next school dance. That's how it is when you're a kid. You try on this person, that person, and you keep on moving. What you're doing, I think, is trying out different versions of who you are, or who you can be. With Jeannie, I remember I wanted her to think I was tough. How I got that across to her was by dismissing all the horror movies my big brother let me watch when our parents were asleep. Maybe she was impressed. Maybe she wasn't. It doesn't matter. I do think about those movies in my weaker moments, much less and less as the years stack up. Until Thanksgiving, that is. Now they're all crowding in around me. Because it's what you do when you're married. Kay and I alternate holidays with her parents and mine. This year, it's supposed to be Christmas here in Milford, with my mom and her turkey. We'll eat just enough to be polite. Meaning Thanksgiving, and it was in Haverly, with Kay's parents. What happened was Kay's mother needed some fast-rising yeast from the store for her famous rolls. And, since I was one of us in the living room doing nothing, watching the game, I got volunteered to make the necessary run down to the store. Of course, I tried to engineer the trip as close to halftime as I could, but the third time Kay stepped into the doorway to look from me to the television, I got the hint. I can't wait for her rolls either, I said to her, draining the last of my beer as if those last couple of drinks had been the only thing keeping me planted on the couch. Neither can she, said Kay with an edge. I eased my way to the door, collected my red windbreaker, got to show team pride, and hot-footed it out to the truck. From previous Thanksgivings, we knew the IGA was open until 4. I still had 20 minutes. It should have been just a quick jaunt down the road and back, and some idle conversation with the unlucky high schooler caught behind the register. Except, this wasn't my home store, quite. I mean, every grocery store is more or less alike, but there's peculiarities too. In Milford, I probably could have zeroed in on the fast-rising yeast inside 30 seconds. In Haverly, I was trolling up and down the aisles. Would it be in the bakery section? No. With butter? No. And I was probably only checking there because I love to go overboard on the butter on Thanksgiving. The cooking aisle, then, with the spices and birthday candles and small packages of walnuts and pecans. No. Finally, I had to ask, but the kid at the register, I nodded to her on the way in, pursed my lips about all her piercings and hers, had abandoned her post, evidently. Usually you can find a stalker or a manager, but this was a holiday. I stood there in meats, the seconds ticking down until halftime, and finally nodded to myself. The back. The storeroom, behind the milk. There'd be somebody back there. There would have to be, in case a surprise delivery showed up. I stood at the double aluminum doors and called ahead. Hello? No answer. I looked both ways, nodded to myself that this was justified, and stepped into the employee-only area. It was cooler back there, and dimmer. Hello? This was getting ridiculous. Had the store already closed? The front door just been left unlocked? Was I going to single-handedly ruin Thanksgiving dinner? No, I wasn't. Moving in a way that meant to signal that I wasn't at home here, that I didn't assume being back in the stockroom was all right, I edged into the suite of thin-walled offices. I would have assumed were there, had I ever thought about it. You have to interview people somewhere, I guess. The motion sensor lights were off, even in what looked like the break room. Hello? I said quieter, with no heart behind it anymore. If I'd thought to bring my phone, I could have called Kay, asked her to ask her mother where the yeast was. This way, I could at least document that I tried. I could have used the store phone, I suppose, but I didn't think of that then. I just wanted some famous roles, and to watch the rest of the game, and to maybe talk to an actual human in a blue apron and off-white name tag. Walking with more purpose now, I pushed through the transparent strips of plastic into the space behind the deli counter. Then I knocked on the door of the freezer. I couldn't really say why. Nobody knocked back. I laughed to myself. I ran my fingers through what's left of my hair. I decided that the girl with the rings through her lips would be my answer, that she was probably standing out by the ice cooler on the sidewalk, smoking an unauthorized cigarette or 3. That had to be it. When I couldn't figure out how to get across the deli counter without clambering over it, falling down into a mess of ice that probably smelled of shrimp, I retraced my steps through the plastic strips and stockroom, pushed through the aluminum doors from the other side, stepped back onto what we'd call the sales floor at the dealership. The store was just as deserted as before. "Hello!" I called again. Nothing. No one. I walked down the wide aisle that divided the front of the store from the back, then hooked it left to beeline the registers. I was walking past the toys on one side, the hardware on the other, pop guns and mouse traps. And then I stopped. The IGA in Haverly is one of those stores, maybe because there's a pharmacy in back, where there's angled down mirrors all around the edge of the ceiling. I looked up into one slanted up over me, and it gave me the aisle I just stalked down. Way at the back of it, there was a narrow wisp of a girl with auburn hair. She was squatted down at the edge of a cardboard display like kids do, where you bend both knees out. But she wasn't a kid, quite. She was a woman, 17, 18, not the girl from the register either. The girl from the register had all black on under her blue apron. This girl was wearing a thin, kind of white dress, almost a nightgown. The reason she was squatted down was she was reaching under the cardboard display, reaching deep enough she had to drop her shoulder down, turn her head to the side away from me. My first unbidden thought, it was that she was hiding her face because of what Clint Burkott's dashboard had done to it. That was when I realized it was Jeannie Silber, dead for 19 years. Thanksgiving wasn't ruined because of me showing back up to the house late. It turned out Kay's mom had an emergency pack of yeast. Nobody noticed the desperation I drank the rest of my 6-pack with. And if Kay's dad noted the delay between him asking questions about the score and me answering, he didn't comment on it. And of course, I didn't say anything about Jeannie. By the time I turned around the mirror to the aisle, she was gone. I'd stood there with my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, I breathed. I'm not too proud to say I yelped when the girl from the register spoke from behind me, asking, was I ready to check out? She jumped too, and we laughed about it, alone in a grocery store on Thanksgiving Day. "Do you know where the yeast stuff is?" I asked. And she stammered, trying to find a way to say infection, I was pretty sure. "Cooking," I told her. She relaxed, smiled, the silver rings in her lips glinting in the fluorescence, and together we found the last of the yeast, gathered together in a holiday end cap with the gravy packets. "Anything else?" the girl asked, and I chanced to look up at the mirrors, shook my head no, and I paid with cash. 3 days later, though, I strolled back in. Rolling my fingers, in my jacket pocket was a dime with the ash from the ashtray of my truck. Looking at the items on their hooks at the other end of the toys and hardware aisle, I fumbled the dime down, then knelt to find it. Tentatively, I pushed my hand under the cardboard display. It was for dog collars. That was the part I couldn't get over. What would Jeannie Silber have come back for? It let me jump right over the fact that she was back at all. I pushed my right hand into the unswept place, cast my fingers around blindly, and then for a moment, I'm as sure as I've ever been sure of anything, a set of fingers lightly brushed the top of my forearm. I stood all at once, toppling the cardboard display. There was nothing under it. The blue aprons collapsed on me. I guess I'm old enough at 37 to look like I might need medical help. I assured them it was nothing. I tripped. This was no cause for concern, and I tried to help them collect the dog collars I'd spilled. But then one of them looked up, her lower lip accented silver. "Yeast," she said to me, like making an identification. "I'm sorry," I said to all of them. "I'm very sorry," and found the door myself. Waited until the cab of my truck to close my eyes tight, let the panic breathing come. I rubbed and rubbed my forearm, where the contact had been made. When it was over, I reached over with my left hand for the keys hooked to the belt loop on my right side, and registered at the last moment that this was wrong, that this wasn't my left hand's job. Or it was only my left hand's job when my right hand was busy. I opened my right hand slowly, not even completely aware I'd had it clenched into a fist. A dusty blue broken rubber band. I shook it off my palm into the passenger side floorboard, and I drove back to Milford. I could have told Kay about this, I know. Maybe I even should have told her about all of this. What I tell myself is, if there had been something to show, something to prove I wasn't losing it, I would have told her. And the thing about Kay, she would have listened. She wouldn't have been trying to suppress a grin. She wouldn't tell me I was getting carried away. I'm not saying she's the kind of true believer into crystals and horoscopes. Kay's down to earth, always has been. I think maybe the reason I didn't tell her, it was that I didn't want to have to imagine what she would be thinking while I was telling her. That her husband of 18 years was starting to slip. That he was starting to see things. That he was starting to see people from his past. People who had died. Which, okay, I'm going to be haunted. Fine. But why Jeannie Silber? Of all people, I hardly knew Jeannie. That movie we saw in the park, I don't even remember for sure what movie it was. I know more about Clint Burcott's Grand Prix they died in than I know about Jeannie. I can tell you what water pump it needs. I know what tires came factory on it. I remember a ding on the left side of its rear bumper. If any of the dead people from my past were going to start slouching around in my peripheral vision, it would have been my dad. There's some unfinished business there, I'd say. He could come back and tell me where that 916 box end wrench that completes his prize set was. He could give me some parting messages to pass on to Mom. I don't know. He would make sense anyway. With Jeannie, I don't know. What it feels like with Jeannie, it's that I was in the grocery store that was supposed to be 99% empty. Like she targeted it right at that moment so that she could be there, do what she needed to do, and go. As for what that was, whatever errand she needed to run now that she was dead, I thought on for probably 2 weeks after Thanksgiving. She'd wanted something that was obvious, something that was supposed to have been under the cardboard display of dog collars. My impulse was to go back, stake the toy and hardware aisle out, catch her in the act, make her open her fist, reveal the earring or whatever she had to have. Do the dead like shiny things? Once you're dead, do you start thinking like a raccoon or a largemouth bass? It made as much sense as anything. And then there was the fact that she hadn't aged even 1 day, as near as I could tell. It made sense, I suppose, but what I couldn't figure out was where all the blood went, from what happened to her in the wreck, from what made her funeral be closed casket. In death, do you dial back a few minutes to how you used to be? Do you take on the form you kind of remember for yourself? The blood, though. I'm kind of ashamed to say this, but I should get it out. Clint Burcott's Grand Prix. That summer after graduation, when it was still just sitting down at Salmon's You Pull It yard, we'd go sit around and drink beers, toasting Jeannie and Clint into the afterlife. Salmon didn't mind. 1 or 2 nights he even dragged a bench seat up himself, drank right along with us. One of those nights, he showed us a trick, too. Evidently, you can trail a line of spit down onto the dashboard somebody's cracked their face open on, and if there's enough blood left in the vinyl, the water in your spit'll reactivate it, making it bloom red again. It felt holy and wrong at the same time, rubbing our spit into that dash, rubbing our fingers in Jeannie's blood. That's not why I saw her in the IGA. If it was, then Dave Timmons and Gracie Elder and Nash Waldrop and the rest of them would be seeing her too. No, I'm fairly certain it was just because I wasn't supposed to be there then, in that grocery store. And even had Jeannie allowed that some last-moment shopper was going to be there, then what were the chances it would be someone who would recognize an unaged girl who died 19 years ago? What happened was simple. I saw her when I wasn't supposed to, when she was doing whatever small things the dead do. And then I saw her again. Because I was feeling guilty for not telling Kay about Jeannie. It wasn't like I was cheating or keeping secrets, I know. I bought her a new set of pots and pans. I knew she wanted them because she'd been strategically leaving the catalog they were in open on the coffee table or on the kitchen counter. Kay's never been the kind to ask for anything, especially anything as extravagant as this set of copper pots and pans. But that didn't mean she couldn't covet them. Maybe she didn't even know she was leaving the catalog open on their page. Maybe she'd been looking at them and then just drifted off into a version of a world where those pans were hanging from a rack over the island in the kitchen. And I don't mean to reduce Kay to the kitchen, understand. She's the most successful realtor in her office, has been on the town council, and she's getting her master's degree by correspondence. But she loves to cook, too. So I'd ordered that set of pots and pans, had them delivered to the dealership, and then smuggled them home in the passenger seat of my truck. Left them there because that was the one place Kay wouldn't stumble on them. We live a good half-mile from our closest neighbor, but still, I'd lock the door and check the passenger side too, just on the chance. Now, in my robe and slippers, Kay fast asleep, her book still open on her chest, I was sneaking out to my truck for her surprise. Because I was sneaking, I turned the porch light off. Didn't want anything giving me away. It turned out, the surprise was on me. The dome light of my truck was already on. I stood there, 2 steps off the porch. The truck was parked like always, with the driver's door toward the porch, so I couldn't tell at first what was going on. Was this Kay's way of telling me she knew what I was doing? Had she come out after dinner, twisted the headlight knob so the dome light would be on when I came out? Except, Kay is a practical woman. She would never use up the battery just for a joke. This was something different. I breathed in once, twice, and stepped wide around the bed of my truck. The passenger door was open. There was a pale lower leg extending from it, keeping contact with the driveway. A bare foot, the veins in it pulsing gray. Jeannie Silber. Locked doors don't matter to the dead. I stared and stared at that leg. It was moving slightly. She was in the truck looking for something. Not on the seat where the pots and pans were, but the floorboard? Then, as smooth as oil, that leg pulled itself up into the truck. I looked from the back glass, fully expected to see her face pressed there, watching me. Nothing. How could there even be room for her in there, with the seat taken up by the pots and pans? I opened my mouth, was maybe going to say something, I guess. I can't imagine what. But was interrupted by her pale right hand reaching delicately down out of the cab, past the rocker panel. Her fingers were spread, the pad of each finger delicately coming into contact with the packed dirt of the driveway, like she was relishing it, like she was putting on a show. But she didn't know I was there, I don't think. Then, quick as a cat, the rest of her poured out of the truck. It left her on all fours, at which point she did see me. Her lips peeled back from her teeth and she hissed. I stumbled back, sure she was coming for me, but then she stood instead, into the girl I'd sort of known. What I keyed on, what I couldn't help noticing, it wasn't her oily hair, her drawn cheeks, her hip bones and ribs nearly pushing through her gown. It was her left hand. It was balled into a fist. She was holding something. I looked from her hand to her face. There was a line of fluid starting to descend from the corner of her mouth. My first thought was it was all the spit we rubbed into the dashboard, and when the porch light kicked on, all at once, I jumped. I turned to tell Kay, no, turn it off, and then I jerked my eyes back to the truck. Jeannie was gone. Still, I didn't tell Kay. As far as she knew, she'd caught me trying to sneak a present in for her. But when I reached into the truck to pull the box of pots and pans to me, I did it slow enough to case the cab of the truck. From my 20-minute drive into the dealership, and from it just being my truck, I knew every speck of it, every molecule. For weeks at that point, I'd been keeping an eye on that broken blue rubber band from under the dog collar display in Haverly that I'd left in the passenger side floorboard. I'm generally pretty neat about my truck. We'll pinch up fluff from the carpet, brush lint from the seat covers. But this rubber band, it was an anomaly over there under the glove compartment. I'd been telling myself I could throw it away at any time I wanted. Just, I didn't want to, quite yet. Had I have thrown it out, then none of the rest of this would happen. I don't think, at least. Had I left it in the trash can at the dealership, or just let it go out the window, or even returned it to the IGA, where Jeannie never would have come to my house for it. It was just a rubber band, though. How could I have known? It was what had been clenched in her left fist. It was what I was missing when I leaned down to hug Kay's pots and pans to my chest and haul them inside. When I worked them down to my thigh, too, to lock the passenger door before closing it, I had to note that the passenger door was already locked. That it was still locked. The next morning, Kay inaugurated the pots and pans with breakfast, and maybe I expected the eggs to carry some bitter tinge of having been close to the dead. But they didn't. Everything was good. Everything was great, even. Normal. Until I went out to walk the fence. It was kind of my Sunday ritual, in lieu of church, I guess. Because we're down from the lake. All the high schoolers, popping coyotes, they tend to leave their beer cans in my ditch. I don't fault them for it. I was just the same at their age. I used to think a beer can fading in the grass through the years made the world feel lived in. Really, I was just leaving those cans to show signs of my passage, I suppose. To prove I'd been there. To pretend, at least to myself, that I mattered. That I was leaving a mark. My Sunday ritual was to walk out to the road in as straight a line as I could, because a straight line is the most efficient line. It's not that I am compulsive about wasted steps, but since Kay had us both wearing those watch things that counted our activity through the day, I'd become aware of my walking in a new way. There were only 14 cans, from at most 2 cases, 2 different brands. A light Saturday night, good for the coyotes. The way I could tell if I'd walked a straight line or not, it was that, coming from the road, the winter wheat I'd always run there, just out of habit. I didn't hire anybody to come in with their combine, just let it seed out. It would show where my feet had parted, coming through. From the house it was invisible, because of the way the stalks bent with the wind. But from the road, my path would be a line of shadow, that would last for a day or two, like when you rub suede the wrong way. My path was arrow straight. Jeannie's wasn't. I stood there at the fence for probably 5 minutes. At the house, Kay was hanging her new copper pots and pans this way and then that way. But by my leg, in a plastic bag, were 14 beer cans to pour into the recycling bin in the garage. There, cutting through the wheat, was one trail going home and another leading off somewhere else. I followed Jeannie Silber. You can tell where the dead have passed. I didn't want to have to know this, but I do. I don't think they're solid, not in the way we are, but there's something there that it interacts at some level with the world. Jeannie's ghost legs had parted the wheat the same as mine had, but the wheat stopped where the trees started, and the trees are thick enough that there is only leaf litter under them. The loam was mucky enough in low spots that there could have been footprints, but I don't think Jeannie really weighed anything. Not in a way that can press a shape into the mud anyway. But there were kind of shadows on the trees. That's the only thing I know to call where her hands had touched as she passed through. In the movies, when an elf girl is running through the woods, she's always stopping to lean on this tree, look back, to lean on that tree, look ahead. That's what Jeannie was doing. Not every tree had a smudge of shadow, but when I found one, I could stand there, take a bearing, study all around me enough until I fixed on another point of darkness. A couple of 100 yards into the trees, even though I'd been back here setting blinds and chasing dogs for years, I started dropping my shiny beer cans behind me to mark my path. Then I'd walk ahead a bit and look back and make sure the can was still there. In some of those stories about elf women, they're leading men out deeper and deeper, for their own reasons. I know this, but I kept following her all the same. I just dropped my 12th can, meaning I was maybe a half a mile gone, was going to hit the lake soon, when I saw a tree with a whole side smudged with shadow. I circled it, looked all around, and then I looked up. Jeannie Silber wasn't up there like a cat waiting to spring on me, but she had been up there. I could tell she crawled up there on the north side. The bark was darker there. I sat one silvery can on the east side of the tree, one on the west, like performing my own ritual. Then I hauled myself up to the thickest limb. Like most of the trees this close to the lake, this one had a kind of crotch right in the middle where the trunk split into its all big limbs. As a kid, we'd sometimes find coach whips coiled up there. Always just one snake, never a bunch of them. One time I'd found a rat's nest in that kind of hollow, sunless space, and came back to it with a pump jug of kerosene, flushing the rats out. They'd flowed down the tree screaming. Usually, it was just rotting leaves and such. Sometimes a dead bird. That's what this tree was holding. Nothing much. Not until I pulled myself all the way up, set my foot there to climb higher. My boot crunched in, through the sodden twigs, the rotting leaves. There was a cavity of sorts. It belched up a stench that made me cover my nose with the back of my wrist. I stood there for a long minute, my foot pushed down into that space. What I was waiting for was Jeannie, roused like I'd once roused those rats. Maybe this is where she slept. Maybe this is where she'd been living ever since the wreck. It made as much sense as anything. She wasn't there, but she had left something, the blue rubber band. It was down there in the muck, along with a silver tack, a sharp little white tooth, a piece of fabric, and maybe a rock. I couldn't tell if the rock was just there already, or if it was part of her collection. I knew better than to touch them. This was for the dead, not for the living. I lowered myself slowly from the tree, stood there by the trunk breathing hard. As much and as hard as I cased the woods around me, there were no more shadowy handprints leading anywhere. My guess was that, in order to carry a corporeal thing the rubber band was, Jeannie had to be corporeal herself, for as long as that walk took. Afterward, though, after she delivered her cargo, she could just step into the same space she had when she left the grocery store. The same place she'd gone in an instant when Kay turned on the porch light. I don't know the rules of the dead. Don't let me tell you otherwise. But I did now know that they like to collect cast-off things and secret them away in hidey holes. I also know I wasn't supposed to know this. I wasn't supposed to have found this hidey hole. Because I was alive. I walked away without looking back and didn't even need the beer cans to find my way home. Until the week before Christmas, I was able to pretend that Thanksgiving and Jeannie Silber had never happened. Sales were in a slump, but that's the way it always is in December. Come January, I'd be standing in the showroom getting to decide which couple out in the lot I wanted to carry hot chocolate to and say hello. The only real difference in me, I think, was that I'd become a neat freak around the office. Which I say office, but I mean offices. Or really office. But we were really all in cubicles. So we can stand up and ask this or that to whoever happens to be available. It's supposed to make the buyer feel like we're all a family. They don't know that the questions we ask each other are all part of a script, some standard call and response. But that's neither here nor there. What matters about the cubicle situation is that I was always the one pinching my slacks up a bit to squat down and pick up a stray paper clip, that staple, and whatever trash there was. I didn't want to round a cubicle wall, see Jeannie pinching the staple up from the thread of the carpet. I wondered if the junk she was compelled to collect was stuff that had happened to be on the dash the night she lost her life. A rubber band, a tack, a random pebble. I wondered if it was like that for all of us, if we're all compelled to spend eternity chasing down whatever arbitrary detritus that's with us the moment we go. I wondered what would happen if she ever collected it all. I wonder, and I wonder, and I wonder, and I left the doors on my truck unlocked most nights. And once, ferrying a garden hose to Kay's parents, I even walked the aisles of the IGA in Haverly again. The girl with pierced lips wasn't there, and the cardboard dog collar display had been retired, and the floors were freshly waxed, not a speck to pick up and throw away anywhere. I left feeling better. One night, even in a partial unburdening, I asked Kay if her high school had heard about our big car wreck over here prom night. It serioused Kay down, kind of made her wince. She looked up and to the left, which is where the past is located, I guess. We did a candle thing, she said, moving the green beans around on her plate. A vigil, I mean. We never knew, I told her. She laughed and stabbed a green bean and said, we were supposed to call over and say, y'all should send someone over to see how much we care. I smiled, too. She was right as usual. You do a thing because it's right, not because you want it to be acknowledged as right. Not that the dead care much about candles, I don't think. I wondered if what Jeannie was doing was trying to arrange her little bits of junk so as to make a doorway, or a path Clint could come back through or on. Why was she in that aisle and not him? Or was he just in some other aisle in some other little town around here? Did he have his own hidey hole, a coffee can left to rust out in the tall grass, a hubcap leaned up against a fence? You can think your whole life on what the dead do, and why they do it, and not get any closer to figuring it out. Until I saw Jeannie, I don't guess I ever even considered them. My older sister used to have a story about a ghost she'd seen, but she had stories about everything, if telling them meant you'd sit there and listen to her. In the movies and on television, the dead are usually hanging around for justice, or to tell some secret. Not Jeannie. She just wanted the rubber band we were always losing track of. She wanted to hold them close and scurry away and put them in their perfect place. Like a child, I guess. A child with a rock they find by the lake. How they'll designate that rock special, perfect, a forever rock, and then you have to put it up in the windowsill until they grow up and forget about it. Maybe that's the dead. Maybe they're like children. Maybe they're starting over. I wish that for Jeannie. It's a cliche, but she really did have her whole life in front of her that prom night. It wasn't fair that she was in the car after the last dance, meeting that tractor at 70 miles per hour. But at least it had been a good prom for her. At graduation, when the photograph of her and Clint Burkott went up on screen, her in her shiny purple dress, him in his big brother's suit jacket, there hadn't been a dry eye in the auditorium, including me. In a way, it was like Jeannie and Clint could have been any one of us, like they died instead of all of us. Maybe when Clint's Grand Prix had drifted over into the ditch, when the grass had started hissing against the undercarriage, maybe Jeannie had reached across to hold his hand on the gear shift. And maybe she smiled at the thrill of it all, and maybe she'd gone out like that, happy and full and ready for life. I hoped so. You'll notice that's in the past tense there. That's because this isn't over. 2 days before Christmas, Kay's mother fell and broke her hip. It was terrible, but it could have been worse. That's what we tell ourselves, right? So, as to not call down any more bad luck, we play like we're grateful for the bad luck we've already had. Like not complaining can be the end of it. Kay's father had been right there in the living room when it happened. And the ambulance had been there minutes later. And it was all going well as it could. Kay and I never had kids, just flocks of nieces and nephews. So while we tried to make Christmas up into something special, it was really just going to be a day off from work, when we'd let ourselves pour a couple of fingers of this or that into our morning coffee. I wasn't even thinking of Jeannie Silber after Kay left for the hospital again. Not until I noticed, way down at the end of the stretch of road I could see, a dull yellow tractor parked on that steep slope like it was a lost cow trying to clamber back up onto the blacktop. It wasn't pulling a shredder. Cutting the dead grass in the heart of winter didn't make much sense. Had probably been dropped off there to dig for a power line or a utility pole, but still, it was the same color as the one Jeannie and Clint had rammed into at 70 miles an hour 19 years ago. I stood on the porch and drank my coffee and made a mental note to call in when the county offices were open again, see if any of our services were going to be interrupted before the new year. Then I heard it. A car's radials whining in the distance, coming this way and fast. I shook my head no. That this was nothing. That I was being stupid. But stupid or not, I dropped my coffee, was running in my slippers down the drive, waving my arms. I didn't make it even close to in time. It didn't matter. The car was a Buick, light blue. It slipped past, unaware of the fate I'd been so sure of. I stood there and fell to my knees when the Buick was gone, in thanks. I wasn't crying. I'm not sure my eyes really know how to anymore, but there was a choking sob or something welling up in my throat. I hadn't known Jeannie Silber, no. But she had died, instead of any of the rest of us. And then I realized, if that was true, if one or two of the graduating class had been meant to die that prom night, just to keep the statistics accurate, or the books balanced, or whatever, then if she was coming back, that meant it was one of our turn to step behind the veil in her place, right? I looked into the woods. I hadn't been in them since I'd followed her. Was that why she'd shown herself to me and the IGA? Was that why she'd left those dark marks on the trees for me to follow? Back in the house, I poured 4 fingers of scotch into a different coffee cup. A whole hand. A whole trembling, unsteady hand. If Kay had only been there to steady me, right? I would have spilled it all to her then. But she was in Haverly, at her mother's bedside, being the obedient daughter. I sat at the kitchen table breathing hard, as if I'd been cutting wood or carrying furniture. I was just thinking. And thinking. And finally I had to see. I rinsed my cup in the sink and left it on the drying rack. The idea was that if I didn't return, then Kay wouldn't have to clean up any mess I'd left. I booted up, collected my jacket, forged out into the trees. It doesn't snow here generally, so beer cans I hadn't bothered to pick up, they were still there, showing me the way. I didn't collect them this time either, which I translated in my head to hope. I was going to need to find my way out again, wasn't I? Yes. Yes, I was. This was just me being stupid. Me being weak. Me letting my thoughts get the better of me. I'd been too alone the last couple of days. Or maybe Kay's shiny new pots and pans. Maybe the copper wasn't copper, but something insidious, poisoning us, making us see things, think things. I don't want Jeannie Silber to be real, I mean. The 12 shiny cans delivered me to the trees she'd been hiding her treasures in. From a distance, I could see it was still alive. Good. From closer, I could see something else. It was covered in something now. I slowed my walk, circled a bit to make my approach even slower. Burls. The trunk was knotted with burls, those knotty, tumorous outgrowths I knew were kind of like layer on layer of impacted buds. Like cancer. I leaned over without telling myself to, splashed my scotch and coffee onto the ground. At the end, I was coughing and stringing the thin strands of vomit away with my fingers. But it was stretchy. It wouldn't let go. I was getting tangled in my own stomach contents. I ran. I don't know how long. I wasn't following the pathways of beer cans. A single burl, it takes years and years to happen. A whole trunk of burls? It meant the tree was diseased, didn't it? From what? From a rubber band and a tooth and that other little junk? Was that what Jeannie was doing? Not collecting stuff she found interesting, but stuff that was necessary for this. Like a recipe. She needed just the right stuff. Finally, I fell over a fallen tree and cut my hand on a broken beer bottle, and then just lay there holding myself. I still wasn't crying. I don't know what I was doing. The next day after Christmas, I fortified myself with a night of rational thinking. I returned to what I was calling the black tree. I had a 2-bit axe. If a dead girl wanted this sick tree to bloom in the spring, let its rotten pollen drift up into the air, then it had to be my duty to stop that from happening, I told myself. I was the one who delivered the last vital ingredient, right? That made this my problem. I brought a flask of vodka to keep my mind from wandering. I didn't give myself time to talk myself out of it. Just walked right up to the tree, hauled the axe back like you do, and slashed it forward into the most prominent burl. It's not how you angle to cut a tree down, I realized the moment it bit into the wood. It's the way you hit something you want to kill. The axe struck. I worked it free, struck again. Of course, the wood of the burl was dense, thick, hard. I've seen some woodworkers go far out of their way to collect burls off of fallen trees to make bowls and newels from them. Something about the swirly grain in there, how it polishes up. I'd also heard tell a burl was like what an oyster does with a speck of dust. Licks it into a pearl. Hunting. Every missed shot, you can imagine, is slapping into a young tree, and that sapling, caring for that slug of lead, layering it in a knot after knot of its best, richest wood. Would I find a blue rubber band at the center of the biggest burl? I slashed again, using all my weight, and the tree splashed back at me, so I had to close my eyes. Not sap, not water, not quite blood either. It was too thick, too dark. Poison. I spit, coughed, wiped furiously at my face, and then, madder, I swung and swung and swung until I carved into the heart of this tumor. It was meaty and pale. This angered me even more, a tree keeping something wrong like this inside itself. I probed it with the head of my axe, and the vicious gut-like meat, it writhed around the metal. "Don't like that, huh?" I said and smiled. This wasn't work for an axe anymore. I took up the flask, poured it onto the burls, and then before the pungent alcohol could evaporate, I struck a match. Held it to the spill until the fire flashed awake. Trees don't burn as easy as we think, but this one did. It went up like tissue. I backed up and watched for hours until it creaked, splitting down the middle, halving itself in 2 directions at once. When the flames threatened the underbrush and the other trees, I stomped them out, and then I waded into the smoke and chopped at the burls on the tree until they collapsed into the embers. It was nighttime by now, but the same as I brought the matches and flask, I also brought a flashlight. I nodded a final goodbye to the tree and started back, using the light to pick out the shine of the cans. A few trees back from the one I'd killed, there was a darker smudge on a pale trunk, as if someone had been leaning there, watching. I raised my arm and wiped it off with my sleeve. I know now I should have been more suspicious. Walking out of the woods that night, I'd assumed the beer cans were where I'd left them, that I was walking back out into the same world I'd left. Jeannie Silber had been out there with me, though. She very well could have arranged the cans, led me out into a completely different place, one that looks just the same on the surface. That's what I assumed to happen. There's no other explanation for what I've become. A dutiful husband is what I appear to be, a respectable landowner, a good enough son-in-law. None of those are me anymore. What Jeannie Silber came back for, I think, it was to pull off my mask, show me my true self, the one I kept coiled up inside for my whole life, I guess. The dead know more about life than the living, and they want to show it to you. They want to make you see. I still contend it was happenstance that I was the one to see her at the IGA that Thursday, though. That really every person there on a last-minute errand might have seen her the same as I did, even the girl with the piercings. But it was me who recognized her, who knew she didn't belong. Not anymore. Me either. The poison, or whatever that splashed on my face from the tree, it washed off easy enough. And the smoke I inhaled from its tumors didn't leave me coughing up blood or seeing things that weren't there. But the fact of me messing up whatever Jeannie was doing out there in the woods where nobody was watching, that clung to me. At least as far as she was concerned. She came back, yes. That's what the dead do. Kay, too. She crunched into the driveway just before the year was over. Never knew to ask if anything dark and momentous had happened out in the trees while she was gone. She had news about her mother, though. A blood clot had shown up in her leg, so it was looking like she still had 2 or 3 more weeks in the hospital, meaning Kay was going to be burning up the road between Milford and Haverly. It was about to be the busy season for me at the dealership anyway, so I just shrugged that it was too bad. Inside, though, a new me felt relief, I think. Relief at the bad news. I was a different person. And then, like I'd probably been expecting, like I was due, I woke one morning to find a seed head under my back, scratching at me. When you live in a field of wheat that you don't harvest, the seeds can find their way into almost every place, even the bed. This was a whole seed head, though. I sat on the edge of the bed and studied the stalk. It wasn't torn, The sever point was flat and even anyway. What I saw without meaning to, it was a thin, pale girl lowering her mouth over that stalk, only biting down when the sharp seed points scratched the back of her throat. Then she spit it down into her hand. At the same time, it could have been caught on my shirt, on my sleeve, and gotten into bed with me that way. I didn't tell Kay. I just deposited it into my nightstand drawer. 3 days later, I woke thinking of paperwork from my last 2 sales. On my chest was a half-rusted washer. I flinched back, flicked it away, pushed up into the headboard. "What?" Kay asked sleepily. "Bug," I said, even though it was winter. And then, after she was gone to Haverly again, I pored over the carpet until I found that washer. It was happening. I shook my head no. No. That it wasn't fair. But then neither had it been fair for Jeannie, that tractor waiting in the ditch for her. The very next morning I found a little oval sticker stuck into the side of my forearm when I woke. Like you peel off of a banana. Neither me nor Kay can tolerate bananas. I stood in the shower until all the hot water was gone, and then I stepped out with resolve. I walked naked to the nightstand drawer. So far, there was only the sticker, the washer, the seed head. Had I missed something else? I went to the utility room and dug through the lint trap. We'd washed the bed linens just a few days ago and found the most damning ingredient of all, a dime. Probably the same one I'd fake fumbled onto the floor of the IGA in order to have an excuse to dig under the dog collar display. I leaned over the dryer and tried to cry. Couldn't find any fluid or heat in my eyes at all. I wouldn't grow a burl, I knew. A man isn't a tree. But maybe I'd get what? What had my dad called it? A bezoar? Those calcifications or whatever an animal can get in its stomach that are also prized by people, not for woodcutting, but for remedies. A bezoar, a growth, a tumor, it didn't matter what it was called, all because I'd messed up whatever Jeannie was doing. All because I'd done my duty. It wasn't fair. I slammed the side of my fist onto the top of the dryer until it dented in, and then I walked away. 2 hours later, dressed in my work clothes, slacks, golf shirt, I stepped into the doorway of Kay's mom's hospital room in Haverly. The whole way over, there had been chance after chance to ram my truck into this pole, into that abutment. There'd even been a tractor in the ditch calling my name. I hadn't answered. I wasn't that person anymore. I wanted to live. "Mama Jenk?" I said to Kay's mother, and she reached her hand out to me, palm down, and took it. Hugged her lightly, as you do for the infirm, and then Kay was going on about what a surprise this had been, and her father was back with 3 lunches, which they insisted we split 4 ways, and all was well. Close enough. On the far side of Kay's mother, nestled between the sheets and her frail body, blood-clotted self, there was now a seed head, a washer, a dime, and a little sticker with tiny meaningless words on it. It was a recipe for whatever the next round of tests were going to find in her, since her bad luck in the fall. Whatever, it wouldn't be a surprise for someone her age to have. I sighed to have the awful necessary deed done, to be rid of the burden. I'd carried the ingredients here in a cigar box wrapped in a plastic bag, and then I leaned back to stand among the living. Except Kay, the good daughter, vigilant as ever, was already at the other side of her mother's bed. "What is?" she said, and then grubbed her hand into the covers and came out with, I'm certain, everything I'd left. Every last thing. She shoved it into her chest pocket of her blouse. "Breast cancer, then," I said to myself, and looked away out the window, to the idea of Jeannie Silber standing in the tall yellow grass at the side of the road, Clint Burkott pulling his Grand Prix up alongside her. She steps in and down. Yes, but not before looking back to smile to me and wave. The dead don't do anything randomly, do they? The whole time since Thanksgiving, she'd been capering me to this hospital room, this moment. I lift my hand to tell her bye, but Kay wrinkles her nose in confusion. Thinks I'm waving to her from point-blank range. And I guess I sort of am. Well, I hope you found that as unsettling as I did. And I certainly hope it gave you some food for thought. Speaking of food, next week the Campfire Ghost Stories crew is probably going to be in a turkey Zoom coma. So expect us back the first week of December to bring you some traditional holiday horror. Pleasant nightmares, everyone. Hope to scare you soon.